However, historically, by kind of a margin, again, if you go back to the data set, it was from 2006 forward to March, right? So it's a very large piece of time. So the Perl sites particularly had a bit of issues. Our Cold Fusion customers, if you will, had the second highest average number of vulnerabilities per website historically. And of course, our JSP and PHP applications were the most likely to have at least one serious vulnerability. When we talk about the likelihood of vulnerability breaches, is referred back to the PCI standard for applications, right? So we utilize the PCI nomenclature for aligning statements such as that. So when we talk about one serious vuln, it's kind of the PCI definition of that. Okay. Historically, again, out of 1,659 websites under management. So David, let's think of this as, again, just to set it. You're going to, from maybe an adversary perspective, here's 1,659 websites that are all public-facing, that's their only business, and you now have kind of a snapshot as to their, based on their platform and based on the vuln finding, kind of where they're at. So websites having at least one serious vulnerability in the set, ASP, ASPX, 74, 73%. It's just a high number, right? Cold Fusion, 86%. A high number of applications have problems, but also you should be looking at kind of the idea is that no matter what language you're particularly picking and trying to configure to build your application, you have similar issues, right? You have similar problems. So it's not necessarily language specific, okay? We personally saw a very large improvement across groups with applications. I'm going to show you what our top 10 looks like here. But as an example, when it comes to the likelihood of a single vulnerability appearing in a website, the ordering of the classes across languages and frameworks is kind of similar, but this is what we see. So for those who aren't familiar with the OWASP top 10, Whitehead is a contributing organization to the data set for the project. It is led by the gentleman from AppSecEU, Jeff Williams and Dave Wickers. But we do provide some supporting data based on what we have, because we do track a lot of stats. But if you can see the color codes from the back, we can agree that cross-site scripting is a fairly prevalent item across all framework components in development platforms. And then you start looking at the other slices of the pie. And again, it's not, I should say, I think it's an interesting data set, because you start saying to yourself, wow, so cross-site scripting is across the board, across 1,600 plus websites, across the board a serious issue, which we know from the news, we know from the press, we know from our assessments, we find that all the time. But it's really kind of a validation that, wow, there's quite a bit in that particular space. As you look at the way it changes, another thing to talk about is vulnerability population. What I mean by that is, if we were to potentially target a particular thing like Cold Fusion, right? We know that all the applications under management with us, 67% of them have cross-site scripting. So you can kind of go out there with the context or the opponent to say that if you were to go test, I guess we'll use the industry vertical that uses Cold Fusion, maybe retail. I'm going to have a high likelihood potentially in this attack vector, because it's kind of a proven number. JSP the same thing, and certainly if you look at the numbers that are there, the abusive functionality, I think it's also interesting as well, that functionality abuses again in Cold Fusion is quite high, where on the other side in the PHP world it's a little bit smaller, but overall the numbers are kind of interesting, I think, based on the data set of applications. So let's look at the time to fix. So once an organization has been educated that they have problems, the average time to fix is interesting. Some organizations certainly are able to quickly fix the code, which is where the problem is, and push and remediate in a speedy manner. Others use mitigating controls for the same purpose, WAFs. But what's surprising is that most organizations, or I should say most time frame here, average or the fastest remediation effort is 52 to 53 days respectively for remediation of code. We also have a point that we can theorize why the ASPS websites have such a long remediation times. And one reason that could be is that the .NET developers tend to over-rely upon native cross-site scripting protections enabled by default in the framework, and do not independently secure their code with output validation. So based on that problem, so I think different organizations have different challenges, and it's partially based on what they're choosing to do their platforms in. When cross-site scripting filter bypass vulnerability is found, let's say the .NET framework itself, the organization may choose to patch their production system, right? Fix the code immediately, or maybe opposed to fixing all their application code at one time, right? So it's not an unreasonable choice for the organization, but it certainly depends on the circumstances of the issue in the patch. So the resolution rate information, again, is a bit interesting. This kind of points out organizations that still have public-facing problems in their code base. So it's obvious that no one potentially, again, see there's some of the problems that we think happen in the environment because we're kind of the tail of the tape, kind of showing what reality is. But one of the factors inhibiting organizations from remediating vulnerabilities could be no one at the organization understands or is responsible for maintaining the code, right? No one at the organization knows or understands or respects the vulnerability, right? That's why things don't get fixed. You probably have that as well within your organization. Feature enhancements are prioritized, right? So it's pushed to market for new feature set for the application to potentially do new features for the organization opposed to fixing a vuln issue. That's constant, right? It's pushed to market in most cases for these organizations that are commercial. The affected code is actually owned by an unresponsive third-party vendor. Right? Organization is contracting third party. They're not fixing the issue in an expeditious amount of time. Problem is that left there and exposed for quite some time. Or another one that we see a lot is, oh yeah, that website, yeah, that's going to be decommissioned. Yeah, it's pretty much on its way out. We're going to be getting off that in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. So that typically ends up happening why these applications are left out there without mitigating controls because internal to the organization, in many cases, it's going away. Or the easiest one, I think, for most organizations to swallow is risk of exploitation is accepted, right? So here's a double coding attack that is technically advanced, and the business takes the information and says, you know what? We're going to accept that risk. We don't think we're going to be hit by that particular threat factor, and we're not going to necessarily spend any time or developer efforts to fix the problem. Because in many cases, how in the organization do they motivate their teams to actually understand the issue and then write code to mitigate it or to be fixing it the first time out? So the interesting part of the remediation side is that SQL injection issues are widely exploited, right? So it's so important to see high remediation rates. As an example here with struts, it's noticeably ahead at like 79% ahead of ASPX, right? So this the SQL injection issues are across all of the different organizations that we see. The technology in use, and this is not coming up on the screen in good color, but this is another interesting one for some. Across the different industry verticals that these websites belong to, if you look at things like financial services or healthcare, pharma, etc., it's kind of interesting to see that even like ASP Classic, right? While it's a dated framework, you probably would all agree, it exists across all industry, all the different verticals, and 11% in education websites is high, and even 35 in the insurance industry. So looking at the organizations that are still utilizing the legacy technologies, in a production environment, there's limitations to potentially what could be fixed or what can be fixed with, directly tied to the framework side. Cold fusion, as an example, is nearly non-existent in everything but healthcare and education. If anyone saw Chris Eng's talk yesterday outside in the other room, he referenced my slide here because it just kind of depicts where we're seeing technology. So a lot of the question always comes back in the community is what should I be spending my time? What language should I really try to learn if I'm coming up? Or what organization, if I'm going to be targeting a different industry that I want to work with, I want to work in social networking potentially, or financial services, et cetera. Where's their investment? What do I need to kind of know and to be on my game? Can you see those colors? Yeah. So again, top 5 technologies in use by industry. In reds, obviously, you can see, it's surprising to see that insufficient authentication is still a fairly large area of interest in testing. These are still, again, across all industries. You can see that that's clearly an area of concern. Financial services, in some respects, not so much, because just based on the color code chart there. But access to the information, cross-server account testing. Can Mary see John? Can John see Mary? Can Mary become admin? These are things that are human tested, right? Because it's not syntactual, it's business logic to determine if authentication issues are actually there. Cross-site scripting, CSRF. CSRF is certainly we think a hidden giant that more and more attacker space that we see is beginning to start leveraging that in interesting attack vectors. So it's certainly not going away, and is fairly prevalent across all of the different organizations. So in closing, some of the final thoughts here is one programming language development framework can be made basically just as secure as any other, right? So there really isn't a clear answer there based on our data set, based on the customers that we're testing and seeing what we see. So there's no recommendation to say, oh yeah, you should be using struts or using this. It doesn't really work that way. You can't secure what you don't know you own, right? And that kind of goes without saying. But we're still seeing many organizations that are still faced with the concept of threat classification as to, or should be threat modeling based on their environment. Having systems that are interdependent, that aren't classified appropriately based on using shared systems or shared data sets. It happens quite often. Assign a champion, within the organization. It goes without saying, but if there's nobody kind of leading the AppSec charge within the organization, it's kind of a problem. In the OWASP world, we've always been saying from day one, don't wait for the developer community to take charge and fix these issues, right? I mean, it's kind of our as security professionals, it's our kind of job to be that light bearer out there, trying to have individuals understand what we have available at OWASP for being able to be better at what they do. Shifting budgets from the infrastructure side is still a problem for most organizations that you may face. The amount of money that's spent on infrastructure to maintain, relicense, renew systems versus the amount of effort and time that's put into the application security world is significantly different. By talking more and more with the people that are responsible for this space, it's amazing the amount of money that gets put in, obviously, to the AV protection, the network protection, et cetera, and the AppSec space is still, even now, 2010, it's still a very immature model. I came out of a company called Daytech Online back 99, 2000. We actually were the first company that did online trading for trading stocks online, and that was 11 years ago. It's amazing to see that we're still kind of at the point of infancy with various organizations in industry. And lastly, like anyone else, is be involved in the community, right? Be involving in the community would really help an organization be aware. Trying to drive that message home. Become part of the OWASP community, host a meeting. Try and get your content experts, locally or from around the world, to come and evangelize and be involved. If you haven't looked at the Open SAM project, I strongly recommend it. It's really a good kind of a measurement as to where you are in the process from an organizational perspective. And in most cases, it's something that managers can get their hands around.